Nazi Germany's textile troubles. Germany prepares for war, 1933 to 1939. This video is going to be the first in a series of videos I plan on making on the resource situation in Nazi Germany. In order to get a better understanding of Germany's situation in regards to natural resources, we need to go back to the First World War for more context. Every nation that fought in World War I suffered shortages, but for Germany, these shortages were particularly severe. A poor harvest in the fall of 1916 and an ever-tightening British blockade led to the so-called turnip winter, so-called because for many German civilians, the only food available to eat were turnips. This, in turn, led to thousands of deaths due to malnutrition. By 1918, millions of Germans were facing starvation. But it wasn't just food that Germany was running short of. Germany had shortages of other basic goods during the war, such as textile and cloth. If you've seen All Quiet on the Western Front, then you've seen that scene at the beginning of the movie, where the seamstresses are shown repairing the uniforms of dead soldiers so they can then be reused. Recycling measures like this helped somewhat, but shortages were still endemic. In desperation, German industry began experimenting with substitutes to try and fill the gap. These ersatz goods were innovative, but were of poorer quality than the goods they were replacing. Coffee was replaced by ground roasted acorns, and roasted plum leaves stood in for tea leaves. German industry tried their best to alleviate the general textile cloth shortage as well. One of the more interesting solutions they came up with involved creating clothing out of paper, and as long as the clothing didn't get soaking wet, it worked decently well. German production of paper clothing continued briefly into the post-war period before these products were replaced by the normal options made of more durable wool, linen, and cotton. There was another solution that saw some use as well, a process for turning wood into textile fiber with a new chemical process discovered in the late 1800s. This process saw limited use during World War I, but the 1930s would see use of it on a massive scale, as Nazi leadership would go all in on it as a possible solution to Germany's textile production problem. Memory of the shortages caused by the war and the social unrest these shortages exacerbated were not a distant memory for Nazi leadership. When the Nazis assumed power in 1933, they quickly put into motion a series of plans designed to reshape the economy to support the war they were planning and to be as self-sufficient as possible. The largest of these initiatives was the 4-year plan. It started in 1936 under the direction of Germany's top male model and head of the Luftwaffe, Hermann Goering. This plan was ambitious and far-reaching and essentially placed Goering in charge of the entire German economy. The 4-year plan sought to restructure German industry in order to produce as many war-essential materials as possible domestically. Economic protections for German farmers were also increased to try to ensure that Germany could feed itself. And state-sponsored industrial projects like the Reichswerke were started. The second 4-year plan would begin in 1940 and continued support for war-critical industries, but also dealt with exploitation of the industry and resources of conquered countries. I want to cover wartime economic policy in a separate, longer video. A key part of the 4-year plan depended on supporting industries that were using the power of chemistry to create synthetic substitutes for crucial natural resources, which Germany lacked. These synthetic substitutes could help compensate for Germany's lack of important natural resources like oil and rubber. These new industries, although expensive for both the state, who paid subsidies to them, and German consumers who purchased them, provided Germany with some ability to produce war-critical materials within its own borders. The idea being that when war was declared, these new industries could continue to produce war-critical materials regardless of blockade or embargo. And German planners did not overlook textiles and textile production in their drive to achieve self-sufficiency. The issue of textile production was an important one. In 1931, 20% of all German foreign exchange was being spent on textile imports. For a country that was trying to achieve autarky and trying to preserve its foreign exchange for buying war-critical imports, this situation had to change. Semi-synthetic textiles seemed to be an answer to this problem. Semi-synthetic textiles, or viscose textiles, are textiles that are made out of cellulose obtained from wood through a chemical process, the viscose process. Although this process was in limited use already by World War I, Nazi planners expanded the production of these textiles massively in the lead up to World War II. Semi-synthetic textiles are created through a chemical process called the viscose process. The viscose process was first discovered in the late 1800s by English chemist Charles Frederick Cross and his associates, Edward John Bevan and Clayton Beetle. This process involves taking an organic material that contains cellulose, like wood, chopping it into a pulp, and then treating that pulp with a series of chemical solutions until you get a fiber that can be spun much like yarn. Side note, if you've ever bought bamboo clothing like socks that are labeled as being made of bamboo, then you're really buying fabric made with cellulose that has gone through this process. It's not a new way of making cloth, it's just a new marketing gimmick for viscose textiles. The really good thing about the viscose process is that it's extremely versatile, and there are many different sources that cellulose can be extracted from. There is even a company that makes viscose fabric from seaweed now. Bamboo is just a really good choice to make viscose fabric with, because it's fast-growing, contains a lot of cellulose, and there are forests full of it. 1930s Germany did not have massive bamboo groves, and so had to make do with cellulose from pine and beech instead. Two types of fiber can be created with the viscose process: staple fiber and filament. Staple fibers are short, non-continuous fibers. An example of a natural staple fiber is wool fiber. Filament fibers are long, continuous fibers. Silk is a good example of a filament fiber. The process for creating these fibers is as follows. First, wood pulp is processed to extract cellulose. Then, the cellulose is dissolved in a caustic soda. This mixture is then pressed between rollers to remove excess liquid. Then, these pressed sheets are shredded to produce what is known as white chrome. This white chrome is aged by exposing it to oxygen. Then, the aged white chrome is mixed with carbon disulfide in a process known as xanthation to form cellulose xanthanate. The xanthation process changes the chemical makeup of the cellulose mixture. This new product is called yellow chrome. This yellow chrome is dissolved in a caustic solution to form viscose. The viscose is left to stand for a period of time, allowing it to ripen. After ripening, the viscose is filtered to remove any undissolved particles. Then, any bubbles of air are pressed from the viscose in a degassing process. The viscose solution is then pushed through a spinneret, which resembles a shower head with many small holes. As the viscose leaves the spinneret, it is put into a bath of sulfuric acid. This creates the filament fiber. These freshly created rayon filaments are stretched to straighten out the fibers, and then the fibers are washed to remove any residual chemicals. And if filament fibers are desired, the process ends here. If staple fibers are desired, then the filaments are cut down and baled. Fibers can be classified into one of three categories: natural, synthetic, and semi-synthetic. Natural fibers are fibers like wool, cotton, and flax. These require no chemical alteration to be spun into cloth. Synthetic fibers do not occur naturally and are fibers that have undergone polymerization. Synthetic fibers are usually made from petroleum or petroleum products. Semi-synthetic fibers are fibers that come from a natural source but are subjected to chemical treatment. They're called semi-synthetic because although the starting material is natural, it's just wood pulp, the wood pulp is exposed to a series of chemical treatments in order to create usable fibers that can then be spun into textiles. The fibers can be spun to create textiles by themselves, but what was more common is that they were blended with natural fibers in spinning mills in order to create a hybrid textile, a hybrid natural semi-synthetic textile. Even before the 4-year plan came into effect in 1936, the Nazis were already attempting to expand staple fiber production. As early as 1934, the government pushed for the creation of new staple fiber plants for producing semi-synthetic fibers within the National Fiber Program. The National Fiber Program set a goal of 100,000 tons of staple fiber production. In order to make this increase possible, more plants needed to be built. Initially, the Nazis looked to I.G. Farben and Glenn Stoff to spearhead the expansion of the staple fiber industry. In 1931, these two companies were the largest staple fiber producers in Germany by far. However, both companies were hesitant to do so, largely because they believed that the market for semi-synthetic textiles was not yet large enough to support an expansion of the type that the Nazis wanted. In a country with a relatively free market, they would have been right, but with a government that preferred autarky, conditions were right for an expansion. With IG Farben and Glanstoff reluctant to help, the Nazis turned to headhunting staple fiber industry experts from these companies to help them set up the plants directly. Former IG Farben staple fiber specialists Walter Schreiber and Richard Dorr were hired on to help. These men and other former IG Farben and Glanstoff specialists were brought on to help set up production in these new plants. Incentives had to be offered by the government in order to get production set up. Existing textile companies were encouraged to invest in building up such enterprises through extremely favorable government loans, and through an understanding that the German government would create conditions that would allow these enterprises to survive. When created, these new enterprises would be exempt from taxes for 5 years, and would receive discounts on transport of their production on the German railway system, the Reichsbahn. In 1935, tariffs on foreign semi-synthetic fiber imports would be enacted to protect these new plants. The driving force behind these efforts was Hans Kehl. Kehl was an early NSDAP member and owner of a textile factory. After 1933, Kehl served as an economic advisor to the government with a broad scope. Kehl would be involved in setting up the new staple fiber plants and with the administration of the 4-year plan. He served as a member on the board of many of these new staple fiber plants. After World War II broke out, Kehl would be in charge of efforts to exploit the textile resources of the Soviet Union that were captured by Germany. The government, in turn, was able to exercise substantial control over these new enterprises. While these businesses were under private ownership, the Nazi government was able to influence many aspects of the running of these businesses. The government had the right to appoint board members like Hans Kehl, could determine whether or not production capacity at a plant could be increased, and had a say on where these plants were located. By the outbreak of war in 1939, there would be 18 plants operating, producing staple fiber for viscose fabric in Germany. As a result of this drive for self-sufficiency, imports of cotton declined significantly. From 1932 to 1938, the amount of cotton Germany imported fell by 40%. And for the same period, there was a 23% decline in the amount of wool imported. What raw natural fibers were imported from new, friendlier suppliers. Germany dumped the United States as its primary cotton supplier, instead switching to Brazil and Egypt, with whom Germany was able to get better prices. In its place, viscose fabric production in Germany exploded. In 1929, Germany produced just 2.4 million pounds of cell wool. In 1937, that figure stood at 220 million pounds of cell wool. That's a massive increase. Germany wasn't the only nation to see a potential in this new textile production method. Other nations, in particular Japan and Italy, increased their production massively as well. The UK, France, and the US increased their production during this period too. Their production increase was more modest because these countries already had easy access to natural textiles and fibers. Alongside the massive increase in semi-synthetic textile production, domestic natural fiber production, like linen and wool in Germany, increased year over year as well, although this increase is dwarfed by the increase in cell wool and rayon production. Regarding the increase in fiber production, I think the figures from 1938 date from before the Anschluss of Austria in March, and so are not including Austrian production numbers. All these figures are taken from The Vampire Economy by Günter Reimann, which I am going to be referencing a lot for the rest of this video. Reimann says he got these figures from the 1938
Wirtschaftskurve Nummer 3,
which Google translated means the economic curve. It seems to be some kind of economic journal. Given the huge increase in domestic textile production, it might appear that semi-synthetic fabric production was a brilliant success. But below the surface, there were plenty of problems. Although textile production was expanding, the needs of the military were expanding as well. The German army went from a total strength of 100,000 men under arms in 1933 to 550,000 in 1935 to 1.5 million by 1939. This number does not even include the other branches of the Wehrmacht, like the thousands of Luftwaffe personnel or Kriegsmarine sailors. All of these men needed uniforms, bags, blankets, and many other textile goods. With the government spending so heavily on armaments, social programs, and providing subsidies to war-crucial industries, cuts had to be made somewhere. Here's an anecdote from the vampire economy to illustrate the situation. In this excerpt, a soldier shares the situation in regards to uniforms for soldiers in the Wehrmacht. The next war will be decided by the relative industrial capacity of the contestants and by their relative command of raw materials. I agree with what I heard from high army officers. Does Hitler really think he can risk a war with the materials we have at our disposal? Don't believe everything you hear about the effectiveness of the German army. When I had finished my military service, 2 months, our major told me, "We have to appeal to the soldiers to be very careful with the only uniform we can give them." In 1914, every soldier had 2 uniforms, and 3 others were in reserve. Today, there is only 1 uniform for each soldier. Another issue was the increased cost for the average German consumer. German domestic textile production aimed to supply both the civilian market and the military. For the working people of any nation in this period, clothing was a significant expense. The drive for self-sufficiency in textiles strained the average German wallet further. These new semi-synthetic fabric blends were more expensive than their foreign natural fiber competitors. In the Vampire Economy, a report quoted by Ryman confirms this. A few years ago, the big clothing shops were able to sell a suit of pure wool for 35 marks. The worker could wear it for years. Today, a suit, similar in appearance, costs 50 marks. The suit is no longer pure wool. After a short time, it looks like a sack. It soon shows wear, and the threads look as if they were giving way. A few years ago, one saw good overcoats in the shop windows from 35 to 75 marks, but they are good in looks only. To get a coat of the former quality, one must pay at least 120 to 200 marks. This quote highlights another issue, that being the quality of the fabric. Viscose fabric was making improvements in both quality and durability during this period, but it still had issues. This increase in production also had the negative effect of depleting German forests. Wood pulp was the main source of cellulose for staple fiber, but wood is a scarce resource with many alternative uses. There were governmental decrees that placed controls on the use of iron, steel, brass, and copper in projects not related to armaments production or other essential projects. These controls were put in place to minimize the loss of foreign exchange on non-war essential imports, so Germans and German industry turned to wood as a possible solution. Wood was being used in construction, heating, and increasingly in many ersatz goods as a replacement for parts that would usually be made of metal. All of this meant that demand for wood in Germany went through the roof. In 1937, the German government requested 50% more wood be supplied from German forests than was supplied the previous year, and in 1938 requested more still. By the outbreak of war in 1939, German forests were being harvested far in excess of sustainable levels. Usable timber resources were becoming so scarce in the Third Reich that by the final months of World War II, drastic measures were being considered to preserve what timber was left. In 1945, the designers of the planned BA-349 rocket interceptor, a vertically launched rocket interceptor designed to be largely made of plywood, together with the RLM, suggested an interesting plywood substitute for the planned mass production of this aircraft. Rear sections were then covered in 2mm plywood sheets, while the center section was clad in 3mm thick sheets. The plywood was glued and nailed to the frames at 25mm intervals. The first step in the fuselage process, however, was to clad the underside of the fuselage so that the main wings and tail section could be attached. The fuselage was designed to take an acceleration of 6 Gs at a velocity of 1,100 km an hour at 3,000 meters with a safety factor of 1.5. For longer-term series production, the RLM planned to introduce the somewhat desperate measure of replacing the plywood sheets with 4 to 5mm thick cardboard in order to save on wood. with state sponsorship of new textile plants and semi-synthetic fiber production, and by providing incentives for farmers in return for increasing production of raw fibers like wool, Germany succeeded in achieving an impressive increase in domestic production of textiles. However, it did not become self-sufficient, and the products its industries did produce were both more expensive than foreign imports and had quality and durability issues. Germany still required imports to meet its textile needs. In the upcoming Part 2, we will be taking a look at how Germany utilized the textile and fiber resources it captured during the course of World War II, and how the textile industries in the Third Reich continued to expand.